The gentle hum filled the air inside Golden Grace Jewelers in Portland, Maine. Gleaming cases lined the walls, showcasing rings, necklaces, and gems that shimmered under the soft glow of strategically placed lights. Each piece seemed to hold a story, a whisper of elegance waiting to adorn someone's life. At the entrance, Ruth stepped in, adjusting her worn leather purse on her shoulder. She was in her late 70s, her silver curls tucked neatly beneath a beret. She looked around with a familiar smile, her dark eyes taking in the displays she'd seen countless times before. Ruth's son, Eric, had poured his heart into this store, turning it into one of the most admired spots in town. She felt a surge of pride each time she stepped inside, knowing her boy had built this success from the ground up. Today, Ruth had come to surprise Eric. It was a routine of theirs. Every few weeks she'd drop by, unannounced, bringing him lunch from his favorite cafe. She had a soft spot for these visits, watching him interact with clients, seeing him in his element. But today, Eric was out. A brief message from the clerk at the front desk explained he'd stepped away for a meeting with a new supplier and would be back shortly. Ruth didn't mind. She could easily spend time browsing the displays, letting her thoughts wander. As she walked down the aisles, her fingers lightly brushed the glass cases, feeling a warmth that only came from years of familiarity. Her eyes drifted to a particular set of diamond earrings. They reminded her of a pair she'd once owned many years ago, long before the hardships, before life's demands forced her to sell them. For a moment, a flicker of nostalgia washed over her. Lost in thought, Ruth leaned closer to get a better look at the earrings, captivated by their sparkle. She moved just slightly, her fingers resting against the glass, but then a small slip. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the stand, and one of the earrings tipped over, falling to the floor with a quiet clink. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She bent down slowly, careful with her movements, feeling a touch of embarrassment for causing a scene, even if no one had seemed to notice. As she reached out to pick up the earring, a pair of sharp heels clicked against the floor behind her. Ruth looked up, blinking as a tall, stern-faced saleswoman stood over her. The woman, who Ruth didn't recognize, must have been new to the store. Her expression was unreadable, yet Ruth sensed a chill in her gaze. There was no warmth, no trace of the familiar friendliness she'd grown accustomed to in this place her son owned. But Ruth brushed it off, trying to explain as she rose to her feet. "I'm so sorry, dear. I just wanted a closer look. This earring reminds me of a pair I once..." But the woman didn't give her a chance to finish. With a glare that pierced through Ruth, the saleswoman crossed her arms, looking her over with an expression that held more than just disapproval. The saleswoman's voice was sharp and cold, cutting through the air like glass. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing as she stared at Ruth. Ruth, taken aback, straightened herself and held up the earring delicately. "I accidentally knocked it over," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I was just admiring it, and I..." "Admiring it?" The saleswoman interrupted, her tone dripping with disdain. "You mean pocketing it, don't you?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and stifling. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. "Pocketing it? That's absurd. I've never..." But the woman wasn't listening. Her eyes swept over Ruth, taking in her modest coat and weathered purse, and something cruel flickered in her expression. "People like you don't belong in stores like this," she hissed. Her words were quiet but venomous, laced with an unspoken prejudice that Ruth felt cut into her like a blade. Ruth's hand trembled as she held out the earring, her voice faltering. "I think there's been some misunderstanding." The saleswoman stepped closer, snatching the earring from Ruth's hand with a force that startled her. "Save your excuses," she snapped. "I'm calling the police." Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. The sheer absurdity of the situation made her head spin. "The police? That's not necessary," she pleaded. "I didn't do anything wrong." Ignoring her protests, the saleswoman pulled out her phone and began dialing. Her voice turned unnervingly composed as she spoke to the dispatcher. "Yes, I need officers at Golden Grace Jewelers. We've caught someone trying to steal a diamond earring. She's still here and I've detained her." "Detained?" Ruth whispered to herself in disbelief. She took a step back, clutching the strap of her purse, as if it might ground her in the chaos swirling around her. The next moments unfolded in a blur. Ruth barely registered the sound of the front door swinging open or the quick, heavy steps of 2 police officers entering the store. Both men were tall, their uniforms crisp, and their expressions unreadable. They walked directly toward the saleswoman, who immediately launched into a theatrical recounting of events. "This woman," the saleswoman declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Ruth, "was caught red-handed trying to steal this earring. I had to stop her before she fled." Ruth's hands shook as she tried to speak. "I wasn't trying to steal anything," she said, her voice wavering. "It was an accident. Please, I'm the owner's mother." The officers exchanged a glance, but their attention remained on the saleswoman. One of them turned to Ruth, his gaze hard and impersonal. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step forward." Ruth took a step closer, her knees weak. "Please, this is a mistake," she said, but her voice was barely above a whisper. Before she could say another word, the officer grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly to the side. The sudden force made her stumble, and she winced as they twisted her hands behind her back. "What are you doing?" Ruth cried out, panic flooding her voice. The cold metal of handcuffs clamped around her wrists, and the sound was deafening. Ruth stood frozen, too shocked to move. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked around the store, searching for a friendly face, for anyone who might help. But there was no one, just the saleswoman watching with a triumphant smirk. "I didn't steal anything," Ruth said, her voice cracking as tears began to spill down her cheeks. "You're making a mistake." One of the officers spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. "You can explain yourself down at the station." The words hit her like a blow, knocking the air out of her lungs. Down at the station? Ruth had lived a long life, faced her share of challenges, but never, not once, had she ever been treated like this. The humiliation was unbearable. She felt like a criminal, though she'd done nothing wrong. The officers began leading her toward the door, their grip firm and unyielding. Ruth's mind raced, each thought more desperate than the last. She didn't understand how this could be happening. This was her son's store, a place that had always felt safe. How had it become a nightmare? As they reached the threshold, a voice boomed from across the room. "What the hell is going on here?" The officers paused, and Ruth turned her head towards the source of the voice. Her heart leapt as she saw Eric standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion and fury. Eric stood frozen for only a moment, before striding forward, his presence commanding attention. His tailored suit, standard for meetings with suppliers, was slightly wrinkled, as though he had rushed back. His jaw was tight, his movements quick and deliberate as he took in the scene, his mother handcuffed and tearful, the officers holding her arms, and the saleswoman standing smugly to the side. "Take those off her," Eric ordered, his voice low but charged with barely restrained anger. One officer cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. "Sir, we were responding to a theft complaint." "Take them off," Eric repeated, each word clipped and precise. His dark eyes burned as he stepped closer, his focus shifting to his mother. "Are you okay, Mum?" His tone softened slightly, but his hands balled into fists at his sides. Ruth nodded weakly, her voice trembling. "I didn't do anything, Eric. I just dropped an earring." Eric turned to the saleswoman, his expression icy. "Miss Turner, care to explain why you thought calling the police on my mother was a good idea?" Miss Turner faltered for a moment, clearly caught off guard. "Sir, Tu didn't know she was your mother. She dropped the earring, and it looked like, well, I thought she was trying to—" "You thought?" Eric snapped, his voice rising slightly. "What gave you the right to assume my mother, of all people, was a thief?" "I didn't mean," Miss Turner stammered, her confidence crumbling. "I was just trying to protect the store." Eric let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Protect the store from my own mother? Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just insult her, you insulted me, this business, and everything we stand for." He gestured toward Ruth, who was still trembling. "Look at her. Does she look like a thief to you?" Miss Turner's mouth opened and closed as she struggled for a response, but no words came. Eric turned to the officers, who had yet to remove the handcuffs. "Are you seriously just standing there?" he demanded. "Do you even have any evidence she was stealing, or did you just take this woman's word for it?" The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances before one of them finally stepped forward and removed the cuffs. As soon as Ruth's hands were free, Eric was by her side, rubbing her wrists gently. "I'm so sorry, Mum," he said softly. "You shouldn't have gone through that." Ruth shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand how it got this far." Eric straightened, his anger surging once more as he addressed the room. "This ends now," he said firmly, his gaze locked onto Miss Turner. "You're fired." I don't need people like you representing my business. Miss Turner's face turned ashen. Sir, please, I didn't know. I don't care, Eric interrupted, his tone cold and final. Get out now. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her belongings, avoiding everyone's eyes as she hurried out the door. Eric turned to the officers next. And you two, you owe my mother an apology. She's been humiliated enough for one day. One officer cleared his throat awkwardly. We were following protocol based on the complaint. Protocol? Eric shot back, his voice dripping with disbelief. Your protocol is to slap handcuffs on an elderly woman without investigating the truth. That's what you call protecting and serving. The officers stood silent, their earlier confidence evaporating. Finally, one mumbled, We're sorry, ma'am. Ruth looked at them, her expression unreadable. She simply nodded before Eric ushered her to a chair near the counter. Sit down, ma'am, Eric said gently, his hand on her shoulder. I'll take care of everything. As Ruth sank into the seat, Eric turned back to the officers. You can leave now. I'll be filing a formal complaint about how this was handled. The officers hesitated before nodding slightly and heading for the door, their departure marked by an awkward silence. Eric knelt beside Ruth, his voice softening. You okay? Do you need anything? Ruth shook her head, her hand resting over his. I just want to go home. Eric exhaled, a mix of relief and lingering frustration washing over him. We'll go soon, but first I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of phone calls, statements, and legal proceedings. Eric wasted no time filing an official complaint against the officers and pressing charges against Miss Turner for assaulting his mother. Ruth, though shaken, supported her son's decision. She knew this wasn't just about her, it was about preventing anyone else from enduring the same humiliation. The news spread quickly. Golden Grace Jewelers, once known for its elegant reputation, was now at the center of a heated conversation about prejudice and accountability. Customers voiced their support for Eric's actions, though a few questioned the decision to fire Miss Turner so publicly. Eric was unyielding. There's no room for that kind of behavior in my business, he told a local reporter, and there shouldn't be room for it anywhere. Meanwhile, Miss Turner was facing her own reckoning. Video footage from the store's security cameras left no doubt about what had occurred. The recording captured her aggression, the slap, and her blatant refusal to listen to Ruth's explanations. It also revealed the officer's rough treatment of Ruth, further fueling outrage. In court, Miss Turner appeared visibly shaken. Gone was the confident, cold demeanor she'd shown in the store. She now looked small and fragile, her hands trembling as she sat at the defense table. The prosecutor laid out the evidence methodically, using the footage and witness testimonies to paint a clear picture of her actions. Ruth, at Eric's insistence, did not have to testify. He knew reliving the experience in front of strangers would be too much for her. Instead, the prosecutor relied on the video and statements from the police officers, who admitted they had acted too quickly. Their admission was a small victory, but it didn't erase the pain they had caused. As the trial progressed, Ruth began to feel a strange mix of emotions. She was grateful for the support she'd received from Eric and the community, but the incident had left a mark on her that no verdict could erase. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the sting of the slap, hear the clink of the handcuffs, and see the disapproving glares from people who didn't even know her. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Miss Turner was convicted of assault and defamation, and the judge handed down a sentence that included community service and mandatory sensitivity training. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Eric and Ruth. Eric spoke confidently, his words carrying the weight of someone determined to make a difference. This isn't just about what happened to my mother, he said. It's about ensuring no one else has to face this kind of treatment. Discrimination has no place in our society, and it's up to all of us to fight against it. Ruth, standing beside him, spoke more softly but with equal conviction. I've lived a long life, she said, her voice steady despite the crowd, and I've seen too much of this. But I believe in my son, and I believe we can do better. We have to. The crowd murmured in agreement as cameras flashed, capturing a moment that felt both personal and universal. Ruth's resilience and Eric's determination had turned a moment of injustice into a call for change. The days after the verdict brought a sense of closure, but also reflection. For Ruth, The ordeal left scars, but it also strengthened her resolve. Eric, ever the protector, made sure his mother was surrounded by love and support. Friends and family visited often, bringing warmth and laughter back into their lives. Golden Grace Jewelers also underwent significant changes. Eric implemented new training programs for his staff, focusing on fairness and cultural sensitivity. He invited community leaders to hold workshops, ensuring his business became a place where everyone felt respected and welcome. The store's reputation began to recover, bolstered by Eric's transparency and dedication to making things right. For Ruth, life slowly returned to a new normal. She resumed her weekly visits to the store, though now she was greeted with even more warmth by staff and customers alike. The incident had changed her, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it made her stronger. One afternoon, as Ruth sat in her son's office sipping tea, she looked at Eric with pride. "You've done well," she said softly, "not just with the store, but with standing up for what's right." Eric smiled, his hand resting on hers. "I had a good example to follow," he said. "You taught me everything I know about resilience." Outside the store, the community had rallied together, inspired by the story. Discussions about prejudice and accountability became more frequent, not just in Portland, but in neighboring towns. Ruth and Eric's story was shared widely, sparking conversations that reached far beyond their small city. As Ruth prepared to leave the store that day, Eric walked her to the door. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the street. Ruth paused, taking in the view, and then looked back at her son. "I know this wasn't easy," she said, "but you turned something awful into something meaningful. That's how change happens." Eric nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And it's not over. There's still so much to do." Ruth smiled, her heart filled with a quiet sense of hope. "One step at a time, son." As she walked away, the bell above the door chimed softly, a sound that had once been routine, but now felt like a reminder of resilience and progress. Ruth knew the world wasn't perfect, but she also knew change was possible. One step, one story, one act of courage at a time.